All right, welcome Barnabas Aspray, Dr. Barnabas Aspray, to the channel. This is actually the first interview I've ever done, and I'm really excited
Well,
about
I'm
it.
greatly honored then.
Yeah,
Thank you for inviting me onto this show. It's very exciting.
yeah, thank you for being here. So I was intrigued. Of course, you're a friend, you're a colleague, you're just down the street up here in Baltimore, and so it's really accessible, and I really enjoy you coming on here. And I was really intrigued by the work you do. So I wanted to get you on to talk about the theology of refugees, namely your recent article on Jesus as a refugee, and uh, and this is open access, is it not?
It is open access, so the article that I published can be downloaded for free by anyone. You don't have to have a subscription to the journal, which is really cool. And it's got quite a lot of attention actually. It won a top viewed article award with Wiley Publishers, which I was very honored by. But I think it's probably helped by the fact that it's freely available.
That is a tremendous thing. It just goes to show the relevance and importance of this topic and the interest that people have in it. You know, both theology and both refugee. Is it refugeeism, refugeehood? How would you describe it? You do more of this stuff than I do.
I mean, I call it Theology of Refugees now, although I was hesitant to do so when I started the research project because when I said it to a few people, they thought that I meant that I was going around interviewing refugees on what their theology was.
I see.
That's what Theology of Refugees is ambiguous in its meaning,
Yeah.
right? But of course, a moment's thought, you realize refugees don't have one particular theology. They can believe any number of things just like anybody else. The refugees are just like anybody else. So
Or-
that doesn't really make sense. So now I do call it Theology of Refugees. The point is that it's a theological perspective, an account of the notion of refugeehood, yeah, and
Yeah.
of what it means also for people who aren't refugees, like you and me.
Yeah. So this article in particular, you claim Uh, and I say that not in a exploratory way. I mean, you can claim something and also be well-founded and true, of course. I don't mean to challenge the fact that you claim something. So just
Or I could say I argue for it, or I
you
contend
argue
that.
for,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
establish, you affirm. Any one of
Yeah.
these would do. But you say, of course, that Jesus is a refugee. Can you explain the gist of the article, like what brought you to this topic, and then your background interest in it as well? I mean, you can probably start out with just a little bit of bio here, and people may be. Of course, I'll link your profile stuff in the description, and people will be able to find you. You've also got a podcast, of course. Um, but as far as like your academic degrees, people can look that up on their own. But I'll share here one interesting. Here's like a cocktail mixer sort of fact about a friend. And you may not remember this, Barney, but this stayed with
Oh,
me that I learned. I don't know if you remember this fact about us that we share that we both entered the Catholic Church on the same day in 2019.
yes, that's
Yeah,
right. And we just passed the anniversary for that, the 6 year
yeah.
anniversary.
Congrats.
Yeah.
Yeah. But tell us a little bit about yourself, your academic background and pursuits, and again, personal interests as well.
Well, I'm British, as anybody can probably tell by listening to me talk, even though I now live in the States. And I theology is actually my second career. My first career was software engineering.
That's
I
right.
worked on the BBC website for
You
many
did.
years, but I felt the call to theology. I don't know if I mean that in a strictly religious sense. I perhaps just mean that I had the deep sense of pressing and urgent questions that everybody needs to think about in their lives, and of a growing divide between the Christianity that I'd grown up with and the society that I lived in, and feeling a need to sort of mediate between those two and ask myself whether Christianity does have good foundations, whether I still want to be Christian, and if so, what kind of Christian. And eventually I felt that I couldn't pursue those questions part time. I had
Hmm.
to I had to take the plunge and go and quit my job and go into the full-time study of theology. Initially, I thought it would just be for 2 or 3 years, but 15 years later, I'm still going at it and enjoying it more than ever.
That's great. And you also spent some time in South America, in Ecuador. I think you had.
Yeah, as a
Or does that
child, my
help
parents were
inform?
missionaries there
Oh, okay.
for, they were missionaries in Ecuador for 4 years. I spent the first 2 years with them. Then I came back to England to go to university. It was a very formative period because I was exposed for the first time to what it meant to live in another culture, in another country, to
Hmm.
have to learn another language, and to interact with people not just from Ecuador but from all over the world. I went to an international high school and made friends
Oh.
with Koreans, Americans,
Hmm.
Canadians, Finnish, former Yugoslavians, the whole mix. And I learned a lot about what it means, the difficulties and the challenges of overcoming cultural and linguistic barriers,
Hmm.
but also the beautiful richness of those friendships that transcend different cultures and different races and different nationalities. And I think that probably is where the interest in refugees and immigration began. It was initially an interest in what multiculturalism meant, what were some of its problems, and what were some of its benefits.
Very nice. Yeah. And you were in a sense displaced, but not forcefully. I mean, well, maybe not like forcefully
My
displaced
parents
in the sense
dragged me. Yeah, I wasn't
that
forcibly
your parents
displaced.
displaced you
Yeah.
in a sense. But there's
Well, I
that,
wouldn't want to claim anything like the refugee experience on
of
that
course.
basis.
But you know what
Yeah.
it's like to feel displaced, not as if it was forced upon you by,
I
um,
know what it's like to feel
external
like I don't
circumstances
belong
or
in a
something.
country that I'm in and not to
Or,
have wanted to go there. It's true. Yeah.
and well, let me just ask then, what is the difference between being displaced and then being dragged across the world to a different country by
Well,
your parents? And I mean, you certainly weren't a refugee, and you may not even want to claim the term displaced, but I think in the article you had mentioned when you're getting into either several definitions of what a refugee can be, I suppose, and you say by certain of these definitions that Jesus probably wouldn't count as a refugee because under certain definitions it's going to depend on what actually caused the displacement. But you opt for a more generic definition of refugee in the sense of just displaced for any reason whatsoever. So you would so if I'd apply this to your situation, obviously we know you weren't a
this
refugee, of course.
is not where I thought this conversation would go, but it's
No, I didn't
interesting. I mean,
think so
strictly
either.
speaking,
But just to get clear on
strictly
what that
speaking, yeah.
displaced means, displaced, who's doing the displacing, and what exactly is happening, because you certainly were put in a different place. You weren't misplaced, you were displaced. You were replaced, maybe. Can you talk about
I
that?
suppose, strictly and technically speaking, I was displaced because I didn't want to go to Ecuador. I wanted to stay in England, but I don't have really, 90% of the experience of being a refugee. I don't share because refugees often have no idea. They don't have any financial security. They have no idea whether they're going to be welcomed or accepted in the country they're going to. They're at the mercy of cultural and governmental forces completely beyond their control.
Mhm.
And most of them will go back to their home country as soon as they're able to. And they've left their home country because of war or famine has made it impossible for them to live there.
Yeah.
So
So
it's a
really,
much more traumatic experience,
yes,
forced displacement.
I get you. So being displaced then would require some sort of negative, almost global in the sense of wide ranging, not global in the sense of, Earth, global, but global in the sense of like wide ranging negative thing, whether it be famine, war, whatever, in your country of origin, and that you would go back as soon as you get the chance once this ends. So would that seem like a reasonable? This would eliminate like career moves or you moving for a love interest or something. Like you're actually going to a place because you desire the place.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we distinguish between a migrant and a forced migrant that way. A migrant is anybody who crosses an international border, who moves from one country to another for any reason whatsoever. But a forced migrant is someone who moves from one country to another against their will in some way. They didn't want to. Um, you say that they're forced. Obviously, I mean, you're a philosopher. You know that the definition of what it means to be forced to do something
Yeah.
is disputable. To what extent is somebody forced? They could always stay in theory. But I mean, Aristotle defines, when somebody is being forced, you probably know this better than me. Aristotle says you can count somebody as being forced if nobody in their right mind would actually do that, or voluntarily.
Yeah.
And in that sense, yes, a forced migrant, there's lots of forced migrants in the world. There's people who have felt compelled to flee because if they didn't flee, they would have been killed or imprisoned or just die somehow. Yeah, there would be a threat to their life or their freedom if they stayed.
Right. Yeah. So not necessarily expelled, like legally speaking or something like that, but if they had stayed, it wouldn't be in their best interest. They may be even
That's right.
in danger, and they may not be. It may not even require danger to one immediate danger to one's health and well-being or livelihood or something like that. But it's just a situation which, like you said, no reasonable person would desire to stay in.
Yeah, I mean the line between a migrant and a forced migrant is always going to be a bit of a blurry one and open to dispute. But by and large, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has a certain definition that involves persecution, that involves the government of the country they come from being either unwilling or unable to provide protection from various violations of their natural human rights.
Good. Yeah. Now you're ringing a bell because I was wondering, now was that in the article? But I remember this was in a video you did for some other production. It was like a theological channel. It wasn't your own. Your own's Faith of the I don't believe
Timeline Theological Videos. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and you were going through is what very well produced, but it seemed like it was a different organization that you were producing this video for.
Oh, that's right. I was just a guest. I mean, Timeline always does guests.
Timeline.
The guy who makes those videos almost never appears himself in them. But it's one of the best known YouTube channels in theology. It's a very, very good channel. And I've done a couple of videos on them. I did one on Paul Ricoeur as well.
Very cool. So then explain to us, like, what would be, what's the nature of this topic within theological circles at all? I mean, you said earlier, you worded it like, I use Theology of Refugees. Anybody can use terms that are idiosyncratic, or they can just offer terms. Philosophers do this all the time. They offer their preferred terms, to replace, whatever terminology they don't like or something. Or you might have said that you use these terms because you're the first one to talk about this. I doubt that. This isn't like you're trailblazing in that respect in this area. But could you just explain a little bit about the nature of this topic within theological circles, academic theology, of course? I mean, does this get talked about a lot? You do cite a ton of people, so people can go into this article and other people as well to look at the literature review part of things. But what's your sense of how hot this topic is now, and then how hot this topic, I suppose, how well informed this topic is with respect to, say, the last 60 years or so?
Oh, it's a very new topic in systematic theology proper. I mean, depending on how you define theology, biblical studies, which is normally distinguished from theology because it has its own methods and its own community, has been talking about refugees for a little bit longer, just because there's clearly so many instances of refugees in the Bible. And actually, most of the people I cite and reference in that article are technically biblical scholars, not systematic theologians. In systematic theology proper, it's still quite a new discipline. There's not very many people who are involved in it. You could say like Anna Rowlands, Glenn Butner, a handful of others, but it's quite a new and rising thing. I mean, it's not the kind of topic that you think of when you think of systematic theology, right? When you say systematic theology, you tend to think of like creation, sin, redemption, justification, atonement, salvation, Christ, those kinds of topics. Refugees is not really one of the topics that you tend to think of. But I have always believed that theology ought to offer its own unique perspective on what is going on in the world, on global events and global affairs. And this is just one example of trying to make that happen.
Yeah. So explain for the listeners here that are going to come across this, either now or in the far future, that distinction you just drew between biblical studies and theology. Um, and then there's also biblical theology, you know, and then you also use the term systematic theology. There are charts out there that are very helpful with like how to layer these in terms of like, pyramid, something like that is as to what informs the other. But just your words, like what's your take on, I mean, you're not a biblical uh, studies scholar, you're a systematic. Are you would you consider yourself systematic theologian then at that point because you're trying to form a theology of refugees, or would it be a biblical theologian, or just you would dismiss those terms and just think of yourself as just a theologian?
I mean, if we go off my job title is assistant professor of systematic theology. So I guess that means I'm a systematic theologian. I
Sometimes
do
you
have
can ask for the job title though as
yeah.
well. I had a professor that was like, "Yeah, I want to be professor of philosophy, but also church state studies." Just like they just made it up. Or you can like just be like, "I want to be professor of philosophy and epistemology," like just like to specify. But this wasn't the case with you.
Oh no, I didn't get to choose my job title. Actually, I once asked if it would be possible for me to teach some philosophy classes because my PhD was actually in philosophy,
That's right,
and
philosophy of religion.
yeah, but I was told, well, we already have people doing philosophy. We hired you to do theology, so that's what you have to teach. And I'm not complaining. I love teaching
Yeah.
theology.
And you
But yeah,
also there's also the term philosophical theology. Could you
yes,
and then analytic theology, which is all the rage with philosophers nowadays. So anyway, I
yeah,
keep
yeah. Well,
interjecting.
so I would just say, like, biblical studies essentially asks historical questions. It asks,
Mhm.
what did a Bible passage mean in its own context? It asks whether a historical claim in the Bible actually occurred. It asks what the Apostle Paul really meant by certain terms or by a certain biblical passage when they were written. It always is focused on the original meaning, what a Bible passage meant. And it's deliberately designed not to ask what it might mean today, whether or not those
Mhm.
claims are true, how we might retrieve that original meaning from the first century or from before then into the present day. So I would say that systematic theology is about asking, from a Christian perspective, what is in fact true about God and the world and the relationship between God and the world. And of course, it needs biblical studies because the Christian revelation is the primary source for any theologian of our understanding of what's true. But it goes far beyond biblical studies because it actually makes a constructive claim about reality and about what is the case today from a Christian point of view, which biblical scholars, by definition, are not supposed to do, not as biblical scholars. If a biblical
Right.
scholar makes such a claim, then they are actually making a claim as a systematic theologian with whatever credentials.
Yeah. Makes total sense. You see the same parallel in philosophy, in other disciplines. When
Yeah.
physicists, for example, notoriously Richard Dawkins, starts waxing eloquently about philosophy, and it's like that's not your job.
Yeah.
You can do that,
Yeah.
but not as biologist.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, so speaking of those claims about the world, let's get into some of those because, uh, and getting into your article, I told my wife I've got to read Barney's article or his barnacle, if you will, and you can have that one if you like, but
That
don't
used
make
to
this
be
stuff.
my nickname, Barnacle, when
Oh,
I was
that's
a
hilarious.
child. Yeah, I haven't used it for a good 20 years now,
That's
but
great. It's going to make a comeback.
yeah,
Um, so you make the distinction. We talked about displacement. We talked about refugee. We haven't yet talked about exile. Um, but you do make this distinction between a refugee and a person in exile. I suppose my understanding of this is just someone in exile that can be just like it seems more singular. Maybe I think of like Napoleon in exile in Elba. You know,
yeah.
this political figure perhaps, but I suppose you don't need to be a political figure to be in exile. But what difference do you draw? Could you explain why do you prefer the term refugee instead of theology of exile?
Well, there's certainly a big overlap. I'm not
Mhm.
suggesting they're completely separate topics. But the theology of exile has a long pedigree, and it's a conversation that's been going on for a lot longer, and it is rooted in the biblical depiction of the exile of the people of Israel
Mhm.
from the Promised Land when they were invaded by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians. That talk about the Babylonian exile of the people of
Mhm.
God as a punishment for their refusal to obey to keep their side of the covenant. And in contemporary terms, theologians have appropriated that motif to ask what it means for the church to be in exile today.
Mhm.
That is to say, are we a church in exile? Are we a church that is subject to foreign and hostile powers as society becomes ever increasingly secular? Those kinds of things. So a lot of the questions that come up, they're questions to do with the relationship between Christianity and culture, the nature of persecution, of marginalization of the church, and of what it means to be living in what we call post-Christendom after the demise of, Christianity's dominance in the West. I'm not really asking any of those questions or talking about any of that. That's why I distinguished my project
Mhm.
from a theology of exile. I'm talking much more specifically about what theology can offer to the question of what it means to be a refugee, and in return, what the rising phenomenon of refugees, or the rising just fact of more and more forcibly displaced people in the world, what that can teach theology in return.
Yeah, you mentioned rising phenomenon, refugee. There's certainly
Yes.
why do you see that as rising? Because of course, you have, you have world powers changing all throughout history. Certainly, you've had, even with the last, century in the 20th century, you have, all these wars, lots of reason for becoming a refugee, um, and wars and conflict. But you also have, think of like anytime the Kingdom of Italy, was formed out of the Papal States, or the Holy Roman Empire, draws a new border, on the continent of Europe. It seems like somebody's getting displaced or,
Yes.
inconvenienced at the very least. But you see this as a more recent phenomenon. Is that a is that a real, um, recognition, or is that just like what it seems, or is that maybe because of the wording that we're using?
That's a very good question. I mean, obviously, displacement and forced displacement has been a reality since the dawn of human history,
Of
right?
course.
There's always been times when war or famine or some other disaster has forced people to flee their home against their will and go somewhere else. That's always been the case. However, in today's world, it's absolutely true to say that there are more forcibly displaced people alive today than there ever have been
Hmm.
throughout human history. And that is not only because there's more people in the world than there have been throughout human history. There's other factors that have led to the explosive rise of forced displacement. When I started this research project in 2019, there were 70 million forcibly displaced people in the world. And now, 6 years later, there are 120 million.
Oh my word.
That means that in the last 6 years, 50 million more people have been forced to flee their homes. These statistics are all on the UNHCR website. If you go
Yeah.
to unhcr.org, you find all of these statistics there. And those first 70 million who were displaced in 2019, they haven't returned. They haven't found a
Mm.
home. Or not, most of them haven't. A handful have. So it's a growing, urgent crisis. People talk about a refugee crisis, and I'm a bit ambivalent about that term, because when Europeans talk about the European refugee crisis, they tend to mean it in a selfish way, like, oh, we're having a
Mhm.
crisis. There's tons of people trying to enter our country.
Yeah.
Um,
There's a very big problem in the UK right now, or at least one that has garnered a lot of
yeah,
attention for people living
yeah. But I don't like to think of it as a crisis for, a first world wealthy Western crisis in the sense of, oh no, I have to share more of my wealth, some of my wealth with. It's a crisis for the refugees. It's a crisis for the world.
Mm-hmm.
And why is it? Why is it that there are more forcibly displaced people in the world than ever before? I guess I could say that there are two main reasons, two main things that are true now that were not true throughout all of human history. One is climate change. There's more and more people, especially in Africa, who simply can't live where they have lived for generations because the land is not producing crops anymore because of the changes in the climate. There's famine and floods as well, just the general dramatic changes in the weather, permanent stable changes in the weather that make places uninhabitable that had previously been inhabitable. And the other thing is perhaps a more political issue that, we live in a world that is divided entirely into nation states. In fact, the way most people think about their nationality, they think of it as a sort of established fact. You can't really imagine anything other than countries. If you look at a world map, all of the countries are colored in different colors, and you just think that's the reality. There's different countries in the world.
Yeah.
But what people don't realize is that the modern notion of the nation state is in fact a very modern notion. The world wasn't divided up that way 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And in throughout human history, if you were forced to flee your home, that's traumatic and tragic and devastating, but you can just go somewhere else, right? There's somewhere else you can go. Whereas now, if your own country can no longer protect you from persecution, death, imprisonment, you have nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
Except another country which may not want you. There's no corner of the inhabitable globe that is not claimed by a nation, controlled by a government and a border. So it's much worse for refugees now than it ever has been before. Not only do they have to flee a place, but they have to somehow acquire entry to another place which has the power to prevent them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned the first, climate change, and the second here. I think is one of the under the radar reasons and explanations for this wild increase. And at first, when I heard you mention the statistics, of course, my philosopher mind goes to thinking, well, I mean, how reliable are statistics? I think it's Mark Twain who says there are lies, damned lies, and statistics. So you always want to understanding of like, okay, well, are they using this terminology? Because, I mean, is the same terminology they've always used? And you want to understand that. But this makes a lot of sense why you would see such a sharp rise. Maybe not in the short time that you have. There could be some, explaining of that. But certainly in, say, the 21st century, the 20th century, to see such a sharp rise, just as you said, the increase in nation states, there's just an accident of history. There's just more borders. And there's no place on the planet that isn't, already inhabited, if it's inhabitable. So that's a really, really good point. I've never thought about that. Now,
I mean, the statistics, obviously, it's more complicated. If you go to the UNHCR website, they break down the statistics a number of different ways. And what I didn't say was that there are 120 million refugees in the world. I said there are 120 million forcibly displaced people. If you look at the statistics, they break that down in a number of different ways. Refugees being one category, internally displaced people who have not crossed an international border but have still been forced to flee their home. And there's new categories like the ongoing situation in the West Bank. The conflict between Palestine and Israel has its own category because the Palestinians requested that they not be counted as refugees due to the uniqueness of their own situation. Right. And Venezuela is yet another rather unusual situation where the people fleeing Venezuela don't technically count as refugees, even though they are being forced to flee rather horrific conditions that make life unlivable in Venezuela. And so they're given yet their own, a separate category again. So yeah, the statistics are always more complicated when you look under the hood. But I'm just giving the headlines to get a sense of what's going on,
Yeah. So I want to one thing that really sparked my interest in one of the claims in the article is that you argue that Jesus's refugeehood was a necessary aspect of the incarnation. That's a pretty big claim. Can you elaborate on that and like what implications it has?
Well, I think there I'm just following what Scripture
Uh-huh.
seems to be saying. You know, in Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verse 15, it says, "This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet." What was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet? Um, well, it seems what had just happened was that Joseph had taken his family and fled Israel, well, fled Judah, I should say, um, to escape the persecution of Herod and gone to Egypt. So, at least according to the Gospel of Matthew, that fulfills a prophecy about the Messiah that therefore had to happen in order for Jesus to be the Messiah.
Yeah. So, what? Point me what? Uh, let's see. I remember you talking about this. Is this okay? What this is? This is meant to be fulfilled. What are you reading? Matthew 2. What's the verse? 17, 18?
15.
Okay, 15. Okay, I see. Uh, so that's the return to Egypt from Egypt, as the prophecy in Hosea. Is that right? So,
In that case, Matthew 2:15,
uh-huh.
it's them going to Egypt. Then further down the chapter in Matthew 2:19 to 23, we have the return from Egypt back to Israel, and that fulfills another prophecy,
Okay.
which is a source of great consternation in the biblical studies community because nobody knows what prophecy Matthew is referring to in Matthew
Right.
2:23. But that's a bit of a detail that would distract from the main point of my article, which is focused more on refugeehood. Yeah.
Well, not. Yeah, you're right, but it doesn't distract from. I mean, this pretty big claim that if if this is a fulfillment of prophecy, I mean, we are basing this in Scripture, and this very big claim with respect to it being necessary. Um, it does depend. So, well, was it necessary that Christ was a refugee? Was it necessary that he be chased out by infanticide? I mean, infanticide seems to be a fulfillment of a prophecy. Uh, the return from Egypt, was that prophecy? It depends on how the prophecy had been worded. Was it worded in terms of just return, or was it worded in terms of this forcefulness? Like you were forced out. Um, in fleeing, so it seems like the details matter here because I mean this may not be the only place. It's not like it's the only proof text we could use to build the case, but with respect to that claim that it's necessary, because here's the thing, like I wonder this because there were many things and features of Jesus' life that seem accidental in the philosophical sense of accidental, not necessary, or
Yeah.
accidental or contingent. Like, some things weren't. I mean, he was necessarily going to be Jewish, you know, but he wasn't necessarily going to have, say dark skin tones, you know, that's just an accident, or necessarily long hair or something.
Well, not every theologian would agree with you there. I mean, I'm not necessarily taking my own position on that,
Mm-hmm.
but somebody like Robert Jensen, for example, says that essentially every historical detail of Jesus's incarnation is unrevisable in the sense of that's just the factual starting point, that we can't really imagine a universe without that because that is the universe we're in.
Mm.
And so therefore that's really the metaphysical starting point of all of reality, he seems to think, the incarnation. I'm not necessarily saying I agree with that, but
Mm.
it's an interesting question in its own right. What of Jesus's life is necessary versus what is contingent? And I'm certainly not claiming in the article that every aspect of Jesus's life is necessary. I'm just trying to follow
Right.
from Matthew 2, which you're right. Taken in its strictest literal sense, what was necessary was that Jesus go to Egypt and come back from Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
We're following the prophecy. And the reason that I claim in the article that it's not just the migration, but the forced migration that is necessary is essentially what my whole article is trying to argue from a number of different places, right? So we start off with why did Jesus have to go to Egypt and come out of Egypt? Well, it seems that due to the theology of recapitulation suggests that the Messiah had to recapitulate the story of Israel in some way. And the story of Israel is a story of slavery in Egypt and fleeing Egypt. In other words, the whole people of Israel were refugees in history because they fled Egypt to escape the persecution, threats to their life and freedom that was going on in Egypt. And so if Jesus is to recapitulate that, he has to also be forced, not just a migrant.
Yeah. Yeah. And this, you see this theming, you see motifs get repeated. This is just a common thing that theologians do. So this isn't something that's novel to you. We see this even in early patristic writers. The idea of like, what do you see these? Oh gosh, I don't know why it's doing balloons here, but but you see this in early patristic writers, them drawing, use the word recapitulation. There are other terms that are used, as say Mary being the new Eve, Christ being the new Adam. Even Paul does this in the New Testament in his writing.
Yeah, absolutely. Right?
So drawing these comparisons, even some of the gospel writers, well, this is done so that it'll fulfill this, and so this is a tradition carried on. It seems like theologians who do this up to the present, to the extent that they're able to do this, this provides a lot of credibility to what they're saying. Because it's the continual unfolding of revelation. You can make these connections and realize that, okay, God had an idea, he had a plan, he intended this because of this earlier thing, and we see that that also just reaffirms that God's omnipotent, omniscient, and he knows what's going on. He's going to also stay the same in his character and so on. So this isn't some novel idea that you're just inventing, of course, but yeah, it does strengthen the argument if you're able to show. But here's an interesting thing too, because although not a prophecy, it's also strengthened when you can tie it to an earlier prophecy, of course, like the idea of coming out of Egypt. But there are things that, say, I mentioned his hair, maybe his skin tone. I'm sure that he wore sandals and that the ancient Israelites before him also wore sandals, but that's such an accidental, inconsequential detail. He recapitulated that, sure, but not in a theological sense. So how do you show the difference between that? He did this really contingent. Nobody is making a theology of sandalhood, obviously. So how do you draw the difference other than just saying like what significant distinctions could you offer to explain what we see as obvious difference between that and the refugeehood?
So the obvious difference between sandals and refugeehood?
Yeah, because both are recapitulated, and yet nobody is taking that as an important thing that we should be applying in our theology to contemporary times.
Well, I guess I would just say nowhere in the Gospels does it say Jesus wore sandals in order to fulfill a prophecy, right? Whereas it does say Jesus fled to Egypt in order to fulfill a prophecy.
So then it would be the prophecy, both the recapitulation and then the fulfillment of a prophecy.
Well, if you actually look at what prophecy is mentioned, that's where it gets really interesting, because it's not actually a prophecy from an Old Testament perspective. It says, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. And if you go and have a look, that verse is a quotation from, let me get this right. Is it Habakkuk 11? No. Hosea 11? That's it, yeah. Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals, burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms. this, we normally think of a prophecy as a prediction of the future, right? A prediction of what's going to happen in the future. And there's a lot of messianic prophecies that predict that a Messiah will come and do various things. But Hosea 11 is not one of them.
Yeah.
It's not predicting the future. It's describing something that already happened in the past. In a broader sense of prophecy, it's a prophetic viewpoint on events that might otherwise have seemed more mundane and prosaic. So it's saying, actually, God was the one who called the people of Israel out of Egypt, and he calls the people of Israel his son, right? Mm-hmm. People of Israel are called the son of God there. But why is Matthew the evangelist calling this a prophecy when it's not a prophecy in the original context? Well, the theology of recapitulation is supposed to explain that. It's basically to say messianic prophecies are not just strict predictions of a coming Messiah. Messianic prophecies are actually the whole tenor of the entire Old Testament, which shows how Israel, as God's son, was called to represent God's character and God's ways to the rest of the world. Israel is my firstborn son, it says in Exodus 4, And so Israel failed. God's son failed to represent God. God's son failed to show God's character and to live up to those terms of the covenant for the rest of the world. And that means that there needs to be somebody else who does. There needs to be somebody else who succeeds where Israel failed, who lives up to the terms of the covenant, who truly represents God's will and God's character in the world. And so they're waiting, even without any predictions, the people of Israel are all waiting for the coming of somebody who will be truly God's son. But how do you know whether they're truly God's son or not? Well, they have to establish themselves as the representative of Israel by doing the same things that Israel did, not in every detail, but in the key foundational moments of Israel's life. So God's new son, if you like, or actually it's God's older son from a metaphysical Trinitarian perspective, God's son is born and has to flee persecution to Egypt and return out of Egypt. It's not an exact parallel, but it's a close enough parallel to say that it's fulfilling what Hosea said about what it means to be God's son in Hosea 11. Does that help at all? Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. Because it ties it to both the recapitulation, it repeats what had already happened, ties it to a prophecy, which Matthew explicitly identifies as prophecy, I believe. So,
indeed, but only if you have a broader definition of prophecy than just predicting the future. Yeah.
And that's a precedent which is set for us already by him identifying this as such.
Exactly.
And that's helpful because, it's a good distinction to draw, the idea that all prophecies aren't just predictions of the future. That I even fall into that trap, that prophecies, that's just what prophecy is. My son asked me the other day, what's a prophecy? Because we were, of course, like the Easter Vigil and we do a lot of reading from the Old Testament scriptures, and it's like, well, this one predicts kind of, but not really. It's really, this one shows us God's character and, it's salvation history. There's a lot.
I tend to think of prophecy as God offering his own perspective on the past, the present, and the future. Prophecy is the lifting the curtain on what God thinks and says about what's going on in the world.
That seems maybe too broad, perhaps, though, because God does that in Revelation. When he just says, "Hey," I mean, even in natural theology, where it's just general revelation. We don't get God's thoughts and what he thinks about the world, but in some sense we do. If you think of, if you get into your philosophy with Plato and his forms, Augustine put those forms in the mind of God. So in a sense, like when you're doing conceptual abstract thinking, you're getting into the mind of God in a sense. So, in a sense here, you could say that even natural theology, even general revelation would be, as you said, getting God's thoughts.
Perhaps I mean special revelation then. I mean God giving a
Gotcha.
perspective that is not otherwise available. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah.
And would you consider all of Scripture then prophecy?
It has a prophetic dimension. Of course, some of those things are initially sort of natural theology, like the book of Proverbs, even when Proverbs is borrowing from example from Egyptian wisdom sayings and that kind of stuff. But we find them in Scripture because there was a decision made to elevate these to the level of something God is saying to us. That's what the doctrine of revelation means. So there's, in a sense, there's a prophetic dimension to all of Christian revelation, special revelation, perhaps. Yeah.
So I want to move on to another term you use. This segues very nicely because it continues the conversation that we're already doing. But you do introduce this term, this refugee hermeneutic of Scripture. Could you explain what you mean by that? And then, obviously, hermeneutics, it's just a fancy word theologians use for something like interpretation. So I suppose that you would agree with that.
Well, hermeneutics just means a theory of interpretation. So, of course, interpretation is the thing you're actually doing. Hermeneutics is second level reflection on whether you're doing it right.
Gotcha. Okay, good. And there's a whole field in theology of just hermeneutics. You can just be like a hermeneutic expert. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're proposing this hermeneutic of refugees for reading Scripture. Is that correct?
I mean, it's one lens through which you could read the Bible. Obviously, I'm not suggesting it's the only one. That's the whole point. Hermeneutics shows the possibility of multiple perspectives that don't conflict with each other. What I mean by refugee hermeneutic is, let's read the Bible and think about what the Bible has to say about refugees. You might read all the same Bible passages and think about something else, the problem of evil or salvation history or something else. And, for most of my life, I read the Bible without thinking about refugees. And so when I first started to think about refugees, I thought, well, does the Bible say anything about that? I don't know. Never really thought of it as a category in the Bible. Yeah. And then when I went back and thought through and read the Bible with that refugee hermeneutic, with that attention to forced displacement, it sort of leapt out at me at the page that actually refugees are everywhere in the Bible. Every major character in the Bible is forcibly displaced at some point. And even the whole people of Israel are forcibly displaced. Twice, in fact. Egypt and the exile are both forced displacement events. The whole Bible is oriented around forced displacement. And so when you use a refugee hermeneutic, you suddenly see that refugees are everywhere in the Bible.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Even to today, Jewish people, I mean, there's been this massive diaspora since the fall of the temple. And, they just been without a permanent home through all of history. Yeah. But there's also this, you use the term people of God. This is worth flagging here. This is a common phrase theologians will use. Would I assume you would obviously include Catholics under that, other Christians as well, who are people of God? I suppose people of God, is that just, in your understanding, just people that this who are Christian, Trinitarian Christian, Nicene Creed affirming people, or would this include all people who adhere to Judaism? Was people of the book, Abrahamic faith? What does this encompass? When we say, because
goodness me,
certainly Jews are still being refugees, so they follow this pattern. But are they still people of God? In a sense, yes. But what way do theologians use this?
I'm using the term
question. This is like this is more of like a background terminology question.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the people of God is a biblical term. It's not as if I invented the term. It appears all over the Bible, and in the Old Testament, it clearly designates the Jewish people, people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, as God's chosen people. What does it mean for God to have chosen them? It seems not to mean all of a sudden that their destination is heaven rather than hell. It's not, doesn't really seem to be to do with salvation, especially because certainly notions of the afterlife are very underdeveloped in the Old Testament and not really the main focus. It seems that the doctrine of election, the doctrine of God's choosing a people, has to do with election for a certain purpose, for a task, something that they are called to accomplish on this earth. And as I intimated earlier, it seems to me that God's chosen people are chosen to accomplish the task of teaching the rest of the nations God's ways. And in the New Testament, that terminology of the chosen people of God is, I would not talk about the theology of replacement. I would not say that the Jews are replaced by the church, but I would talk perhaps about the theology of reconstitution. That Jesus chooses 12 disciples, clearly referencing the 12 tribes of Israel, saying he's reconstituting Israel around himself. He then becomes the central locus point, the central reference point of the newly constituted people of God. And going forward, the people of God are going to be defined by their relation to Jesus. Whether exactly how you draw those boundaries, whether you just include people baptized in the Trinitarian formula or people who in some way just are trying to follow Jesus however they know best, trying to do what Jesus says because Jesus is the one who says it. I'm not really interested in drawing hard lines and hard boundaries there. I'm interested in the general idea that God has chosen a people who nowadays are constituted around their relationship to Jesus, whose task is to transform the world in the light of Christ and to represent Christ-like behavior and attitudes to the rest of the world for the purposes of mission and evangelization.
I think I had tracked down this question and pursued it because I recall you using the term in one of your headings, and of course that's why I left out the page, of course, but it was on 389, page 389, under part 1, that bold heading. You said Jesus was displaced because the people of God are displaced, and of course, so that's an interesting title, of course. I wonder why you didn't use the term "were displaced," and this would be, tie into the. I don't mean to be criticizing your of course wording here. It's already in print. It's been in print and it's already done. Of course, that's not the reason for this, but just to get into your mind of like what you mean by this. Of course, if you had used the people of God were displaced, this would fall right in line with what we had been discussing about this recapitulation, this fulfillment of prophecy, and that Jesus necessarily had to be because they were. But you instead use the word "are." The people of God are displaced, and Jesus was displaced because of that. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Well, I mean, essentially, it just shows that the people of God are displaced.
My question a little bit more. I'm not going to quibble about whether you used a word, a certain word or not, but given the fact that you did use the word "are," did you mean to convey that it's not just the fact that he fulfilled the prophecy and that he did what, it's worth also mentioning that Israel, him being Israel, I called my son out of Egypt. Israel was the name of a person, Jacob. So that's neither here nor there now. But not just that he did this in the past, but that he is also maybe the people of God currently are displaced. And this gets into our current day applications with respect to the church being, other theologians, as you mentioned, have used the word exile, the church in exile. Is this what you were trying to get at?
Absolutely. And in the article, I give 3 different reasons to see the contemporary church as in a state of displacement. One of which has to do with the foundations of the notion of the people of God, which goes all the way back to Abraham. Abraham was displaced. He was first of all a migrant. Of course, he wasn't forcibly displaced to begin with because he chose to. And if a forced displaced is someone who doesn't choose, Abraham did choose to obey God's calling and to leave the land that he came from and go to another land. But very soon in the same chapter, we find Abraham experiencing forced displacement, not just once, but multiple times in his life. And if the founder of all the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, is a migrant who's familiar with forced displacement, then all Christians, Jews, and Muslims who look to that founder should see themselves as established upon a situation of forced displacement, a situation of displacement, an experience of displacement. So that's one reason. Another reason has to do with the displacement of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. In that sense, all humanity are displaced because all humanity participate in that exile from the Garden of Eden that Adam and Eve experienced through the fall. And then thirdly, because in the New Testament, the newly constituted people of God are described several times in Paul's and in Peter's letters as a people in exile, a displaced people, a people who are not where they belong, because we are in the world and yet we are not of the world.
Yeah, and that gets to where, if you don't mind, I want to turn the conversation now, because obviously this has immense implications and payoffs for current day applications. You didn't get into this in great detail in the article because it just wasn't the scope, it wasn't the focus at the time. But would you care to elaborate more on present day applications and how, in particular, if we Christians see ourselves as refugees, how that changes our behavior, our outlook, and then we can even think about from the perspective of actual refugees, not just spiritual refugees, but actual refugees, that our treatment of them. I mean, this is one big broad question. We can take it in turns, but begin wherever you like.
What does it mean for us to see ourselves as displaced? Well, I think it's a sharp reminder to all Christians that our citizenship is in heaven, as the Apostle Paul says in Philippians 3, that we're not supposed to belong on earth, that our primary citizenship is not an earthly citizenship. We should not primarily identify with any particular nation or nationality. That may be a secondary identification, and not necessarily a completely fallen or bad one, but our primary allegiance is to the people of God, over and above our allegiance to a particular nationality. And what that means is that we shouldn't, there's a problem if we feel too comfortable and at home in the world. That's relatively clear throughout the New Testament, that being comfortable and at home in the world is a dangerous and worrying sign that you have become worldly.
Yeah.
The world is fallen, the world is depraved, the world is full of oppression and injustice and inequality. And if you're comfortable in the world, then it means you're not sufficiently setting yourself apart from all of that fallenness and injustice. You're perhaps participating in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is encouraging, just from my personal perspective, to hear. When I think about this, when I think from this perspective, anytime I encounter difficulty, then I can just be reminded, this earth is not our home. We're wayfarers. We are pilgrims through this land. But it also has, so that's, I think, spiritually edifying, very, very, very much so. Reminds us that God didn't just leave us here. We have on record all the times that, even though his people were displaced, certain major characters were displaced in the Bible, God came through, he was faithful. But it also has this reminder as well that, now, especially in this country, in the United States, major problem maybe for I don't know, since the 70s, 80s or something, has been this kind of Christian nationalism. You get the religious right, several decades ago. And that's worrying to many people, the idea that now, and maybe it's a function of, again, we have more borders. It's just this accident of history, but I suppose there have been other times in history when the Pope was also a secular leader of some sort, as well as being Pope, that kind of get entangled. His spiritual leader gets entangled with worldly leadership. not necessarily bad way, but it could give people this sense of like, well, maybe I need to be more invested here. In the sense, not necessarily in the sense of like you do need to be invested. Obviously, you need help around and stuff, and not just totally check out. But the idea that this would be your primary identity now, that could be really, really problematic. So obviously, this had to be on your mind as you're writing this as well. I think you do mention this once or twice in the article, especially near the end. This idea that this has implications for how we understand Christian nationalism and our primary identity as Christians.
Indeed, it does. I mean, I think the notion of the people of God as displaced puts a big question mark over the very notion of a Christian nation, whether that is a coherent notion. I don't end up saying in the article that it's an impossible idea or a completely incoherent notion. It depends. There's so many different possible meanings of a Christian nation. What do you mean by a Christian nation? A nation all of the inhabitants of whom are baptized, or a nation whose laws are, at least according to some people, based on Christian values? There's lots of different definitions. All I do say is that if there is such a thing as a nation that is Christian, it ought to function a bit like a nation that is made up of refugees, right? A nation that's made up of people who didn't originally belong there and who don't primarily identify in their first identity as being part of that nation. And if there is a nation made up entirely of refugees, and there were proposals back in 2015 to establish a refugee nation on an island in Indonesia. It's a very interesting project. I didn't know that. And to allow all refugees to go there and have their own government and that kind of thing. And they even designed a refugee flag and that kind of thing. But such a nation would not possibly be closing its borders to other refugees that hadn't yet gone in. Yeah.
Some people seem to suggest or even outright desire that the United States is like this, and that this big melting pot of society, that just
a nation of immigrants, that kind of thing. A nation
of immigrants, of course. We've been around for a little while now, coming up on the 250th anniversary, which is pretty significant, of course. But it's continually been immigrated to, and yet you have people push back on this, of course, that such a state would be impracticable. It would be, if not outright impossible, it'd be if you don't have a shared identity, a shared language, meaningful borders, that sort of thing, that it could just be unworkable in practice. Now, I know that you didn't explicitly, you mentioned the island, maybe, was it in Singapore or something like that? So I have no idea how that would have worked out, but what do you think to this idea, if you don't mind waxing eloquently about this?
Well, I'm very clear in the article that I'm not articulating a theology that leads inevitably to a political stance on open borders, or even to any particular political.
That's right. I'm glad I'm glad that you restated that here. Yeah. I'd forgotten that you mentioned.
There's nothing wrong with borders as such. On the contrary, there's something right with borders. And even the UNHCR says that if somebody is a known terrorist, no nation is legally required to permit them entry into its borders. So I'm not advocating open borders. What I am advocating is that if a nation seeks to establish itself on Christian values and is proud of being a nation that upholds Christian values, one of those values needs to include the welcome of refugees. Not necessarily all immigrants, but the welcome of those who find no home elsewhere, the welcome of those who are significantly disadvantaged in some way. Because that is a core Christian value. And if a nation is not practicing that value, then it can't call itself a Christian nation. It has lost a core aspect of Christian identity.
Yeah. Yeah. It is really hard to put your finger on what people mean by Christian nation. Something that the idea itself is, it's not, you can't have a Christian nation I mean, because, a Christian would be an individual, you know, and obviously you're not going to have complete and absolute uniformity among all your people, but so they have to loosen up the definition a little bit. What do you mean by Christian nation? It's not going to be every single person. What do you mean? Okay, is it going to be the majority? Perhaps then it might still include the United States, because statistically speaking, I think the largest share, maybe not the majority, like over 50%, but I think the largest share of religion would be Christian in its various denominations. Or you might loosen up even more and just say, regardless of what people believe currently, it's some sort of echoes of Christian values that they're still adhering to. But then if you loosen it up that much, why would they feel the desire and need to continue to integrate these Christian values? See what I mean? Like, it's just like, well, we'll find some that work for us, but others, like this newfangled, if they get to that point, this newfangled theology of refugees, we haven't heard about that before. We're only going to go with Christian values as we see them, as we like them. And so you sort of have this that can become problematic. Sorry, it's not really a question there.
I mean,
this idea of questioning what the idea of a Christian nation is and looking at its various possible meanings.
Being selective about Christian values is a problem that people across the political spectrum are in danger of, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's one of the consequences of the polarization that drives people to become radical leftist or radical rightists, mm-hmm. is that because Christianity is not adequately represented by either side, those on the far right and those on the far left end up being selective about what they mean by Christian values. Mm-hmm. And choosing some and rejecting others for no clear reason other than personal preference.
Yeah. This gets into a deeper issue about, the philosophies that have been invaded, like modernism, postmodernism, and so on. But you are, in your approach, I've seen you elsewhere acknowledge that you are very ecumenical about these things, in the sense that, obviously you are Catholic, but you are ecumenical in the sense that this is just, well, especially in your podcast, probably for Theology of Refugees as well. It's not Catholic specific, although we do have, Pope Francis, may he rest in peace, him recently reaffirming what the church has taught for a while now, and even is in our Catholic Catechism, the idea that if a refugee comes to your borders, you should let them, or at least hear their case, right?
Yes.
If an immigrant, I suppose, I don't know what the wording is in the Catechism, but something like, it might just be that if an immigrant comes to your borders.
Well, if somebody claims asylum, then under the United Nations, the nation is legally required to process their asylum claim. That is to say, weigh the evidence and judge whether this person is in fact a refugee or not. So they have to allow them at least temporary asylum while they are assessing that claim. From an ecclesial perspective, I think what the Catholic Church teaches, and the Catholic Church has a ton of literature on migration. There's mm-hmm. magisterial documents going all the way back from almost 100 years ago that talk about migration. And they're relatively clear that a nation has a right to control its borders, mm-hmm. but also people have the right to migrate. Refugees have the right to claim asylum and to be welcomed and protected. How those rights balance out against each other, whether there's a conflict between those rights, it seems to me relatively clear from my reading of all those magisterial documents that the right of the most vulnerable and needy person in the equation takes precedence if there is a conflict. That is to say, if the nation is relatively wealthy mm-hmm. and the refugees are in a very desperate situation, then the right of the refugees is takes priority over the right of the nation to control its borders.
Yeah.
The nation is obligated from a Christian point of view to accept those refugees.
Yeah. This matches my reading of some. I've not read all of them, but some document here or there. It might have been papal encyclical from Francis, or it might have been the Catechism itself. But this is the exact wording that I've read up on as well. Yeah, but I like the idea. I like that the church, the Catholic Church, recognizes that there are rights on both sides, because that's fair, right? But it comes down to balancing out those rights in the best way. And as you said, it's going to be, if you have, this is an obvious case, not all cases are so obvious, but if you have a really wealthy country and then you have a really impoverished, and certainly if they're in danger, refugee who's fleeing for their life, then that's an obvious case. But you're going to have a lot of gray area cases as well, where it's just not obvious. Should I flee to, I don't know, Estonia, who is not relatively wealthy? Well, not one of the G20 nations. I don't think so. But just because, I don't know, I'm experiencing some political conflict, that's when those gray areas come in. You're like, I don't know, so yeah, what should Christians, assuming that, the people who are going to watch this aren't all leaders of their nation, of course, they can't just make policy, just because they want to, it doesn't work like that overnight. But what can a Christian do who's just your average everyday person, and takes to heart this theology of refugees, can certainly do their part to read scripture with that lens, that hermeneutic, that understanding, and be therefore formed and edified and enlightened by it. But having done that, how should this change their behavior in the everyday? Does this require someone to perhaps donate to certain charities, to, I don't know, more extreme, to maybe host somebody who is a refugee in their own home? I know this lies outside the scope of the original article, but surely you've thought about this. And what ideas do you have that you've thought about these things?
Well, there's tons that any individual can do to further the cause of refugees in the world. I mean, the first one is just to start talking about it, to start making it an issue, reading the Bible that way. The Evangelical Immigration Table has come up with an excellent set of resources for Bible studies, with immigration in the forefront. Donating to charities is obviously a very easy, a very simple thing, but certainly much neglected. Finding a local refugee charity and volunteering for them, getting to know refugees in the area, supporting them, helping them integrate, teaching them English, joining little cafes where they get opportunities to speak English and to get to know people. Finding out that there are actually refugees, plenty of them in your local area, that you may not have noticed or seen or be aware of before, is the first start to an incredible transformation and a gift that refugees bring to people. It's not just out of charity, it's not just out of a sense of duty that people should be doing this. You gain a lot from getting to know these people. You gain more than you give, I think, from the personal encounter with people who've experienced this kind of thing.
That's excellent. I did not even know such things exist, like these sort of, would you call them, refugee cafes or something? These sort of like interactive, conversational groups.
Well, one of the main problems that refugees encounter when they arrive is that they don't speak the language. Yeah. And can you imagine suddenly being dumped in the middle of Japan without any resources, without a home, without speaking the language? What would it be like for you,
Yeah.
After you were given a bed and a roof over your head, the next thing you would need is to learn Japanese.
Yeah.
And how are you going to learn Japanese if nobody is going to teach you?
Yeah.
So there's those kinds of things. We're both in Baltimore. Baltimore has the headquarters for the global Lutheran refugee charity called Global Refuge.
Is that the one there at the intersection of Light Street?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. We've gone to a couple of their meetings because my wife has a friend who works for them, and they do really great work, really amazing work.
Exactly. So there's tons that anybody can do wherever they are
Mm-hmm.
to get involved, to learn about it, to read the Bible that way, to donate, to volunteer, but also to make it a political priority, to make it something that they consider one of their criteria when they're considering who to vote for, what kind of a politics they want.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Of course, it's not a. Do you consider this to be a single vote, like a single issue, sort of single platform issue?
Oh, I don't think anything should be a single issue.
I think the
Politics is
thing
way
that
more
comes the
complicated.
closest for me would be abortion, just because it's so grave and widespread, and people are so in error about it. If anything were to come that close, it would be that to a single platform vote. Uh, but you wouldn't think that. I mean, not with respect to abortion, but you're just kind of the mind that obviously you just got to balance these things out, and you know,
I am not proposing to instruct people how much a priority
yeah,
immigration should be for them. All I'm telling them is that it should be one of the
hmm
things that they consider when they vote, and that when they consider it, it's very clear what the Christian approach actually looks like, and they need to measure up which political party they're voting for best approaches the Christian ideal of this.
good, yeah. So yeah, this has been really terrific, Barney. Thank you for coming on. I guess we can wrap it there. I could
Yeah.
keep going on and pick your brain about these things. It's really terrific, and maybe I can ask you later about all the other sources and resources locally and then nationally and internationally, of course. There's some really great work out there being done, but we should probably stop there, even though I don't want to.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, I really appreciate you, Barney. And I'll put all your information in the description, and then I'll also link
Awesome.
your podcast there as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Barney. I'll talk to you later.
All right.
Bye bye.